My name is Silvia Fernandez, and I will be moderating the following panel, where we will discuss about Chile's economic growth path. For years, Chile stood out in Latin America as a model of economic stability and openness. However, after decades of progress, we are now facing slower growth and seeing signs of fatigue in that model. At the same time, the world is changing rapidly. Technology, sustainability, and demographic shifts are reshaping the global economy. The question is, how does Chile adapt, compete, and lead in this new environment? I would like to focus this panel on reflection, but most important, on vision. Let me start by introducing our panelists, three leaders whose experience covers public policy, economics, and global business. Ignacio Briones, former Minister of Finance and professor at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. He is a leading voice on fiscal responsibility, institutional reform, and long-term policy design. José Gregorio, former governor of the Central Bank and current dean at Universidad de Chile. He served as Minister of Economy, Mining, and Energy, and is one of Chile's top economists with deep expertise in monetary policy and global markets. Enrique Ostalé, business leader and former president and CEO of Walmart in Europe, Latin America, and Africa. In 2023, he became chairman of Falabella, bringing a strategic global view on corporate leadership and economic growth. Thank you for joining this conversation, and welcome to Chile Day.
Thank you.
Jose, let me start by setting the economic context. What macroeconomic reforms do you consider essential for Chile to return to a growth path above 3% on the coming years?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. And I'm curious about the question, but I think that if there is something that is, we hear before about issues on capital markets, and there is, but if you look at the global view, Chile, on the macroeconomic front, is quite strong economy. It has a very strong central bank. It has very good public finance. I will make some comments, and a very strong financial system. So there is nothing that can derail us, although it doesn't help. It is a basis to not to have crisis, but it doesn't help you to grow much faster. That's the problem that we have. We have indeed a fiscal challenge, and I think that this is the key thing for next government, and we have to be careful. And I think that this is where we have to put some effort. And Chile is a country with low level of public debt, is well managed, but if you look at the longer term perspective, Chile is one of the countries with a low level of public debt, but is within emerging markets, is one of the countries with the largest increase in public debt in the last 10 years. So at those trends, I won't say at which trends, at those trends, we'll get to 50 and we can keep going. So I think that's very important, especially with the country, and I think that this is something that we worry a lot, that has a lot of demands. For example, with the PGU, with the obligatory pension, and with a good system of social safety net, there is always the risk that this can grow up. And so I think that the main challenge, I would say, is to have a path of fiscal responsibility, as we have had before, but containing the growth of public debt.
Thank you. Enrique, from the perspective of the private sector, and considering especially productivity and innovation, what changes must companies adopt internally to become true engines of innovation and inclusive growth? And what are the main barriers that Chilean companies face when trying to unlock their growth potential?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm a little bit intimidated here with these two former ministers, and I have never had a public role. So,
but you do.
We need to hear your private role.
Well,
in
that sense, maybe government role. But I would say that of course, innovation is key to many aspects of what we do and in all aspects of life. And I think Chilean companies, they do a good job in terms of unlocking innovation. And it's not about creating new things. It's about adopting and changing and how you need to adopt. And in my career, I will say I had probably the privilege of being a first seat, being a front seat in the front seat of all this digital disruption that took place and impacted the retail industry quite a bit. And in this case, being part of a company, a large company like Walmart here in the US, and so you can observe and what happens in the company when they see threats or they see changes. Probably they were not only threats, but also changes taking place. And what were the reaction? And I would say, I would have two advice here, two recommendations. First of all, it's don't jump into conclusion too quickly. Because the same questions that you have, and I remember very explicitly in the case of Walmart when Amazon started, coming out and improving and growing, and the first reaction was, well, we need to create a similar company, otherwise we will be locked out of. We will not be able to compete if we are not create like us. Amazon is defined like a poor player in the digital world. And we are not, so we have to do that. And that was the first reaction. That was the first answer to the same to the question of how we stay competitive. But then the question, although the questions stay the same, the answers start changing because they didn't do very well. And although they were investing a lot, but the other guys were running at 100 kilometers per hour, and we were running like at 10 kilometers per hour for obvious reason, because we have to manage all the business, we have to invest in all the business. They were just 100% focused. But they realized during this journey that although Amazon was a threat, it was not necessary. It was the answer was to create a Me Too, same, and they realized that they have assets that were quite important in going forward, and they can build through that, and they can use their own competitive advantage to continue to be relevant to customers, even in the digital. Well, that's one recommendation is don't jump into conclusion too quickly. The same is happening with the AI now. And the second recommendation is that in terms of innovation, don't try to control the agenda. Another discussion is always within the company, should we have one agenda for the whole company or one centralized, probably well-thought agenda? And it's very, very hard to manage innovation that way. Another learning is you need to leave the different units, you need to leave the different part of the company to develop their own innovation, to create their own proof of concepts of different things they think is relevant. Look for the green shot. Don't try to control the agenda, because I think you will fail. For example, just in Falabella now, of course, we are addressing the AI opportunities very seriously, but we don't have a central agenda. But we have many things going on. We have more than 60 projects, a lot of the in the proof of concept stage, but we are seeing already very good results in many different aspects. Just can share a couple of them. For example, something we will say very simple is we are summarizing the reviews of the customer. Customer review their experience. They do product review, and with AI we're able to summarize hundreds of thousands of reviews for the customer, a fair review where they summarize, and you will be. It's interesting how much that helps to improve sales. We're using similar technology, AI also, but massively to put in more emotional description. You say, why is so relevant emotional? Well, they are. They do improve sales also if you use emotional description in a massive way. We're talking about massive way, and also we're using the banking, etc. In many aspects. So those would be my two recommendations for
Thank you,
more
Enrique.
managerial
Thank you.
point of view.
Ignacio, let me shift into institutions and social security. How do you assess the potentials of the potential impact on Chile's pension reform on long-term economic growth, and more concrete on capital markets? What's your view considering both social protection and investment capacity?
Thank you for the question, for the invitation, and you for being here. I think this is an important question, very important, both from the Chileans in this room and also for the foreigners. Because aside from the very specific difference we can have on some parts of the reform, I would like to focus on the broad picture. And in my opinion, the broad picture is quite positive. First of all, because on the pension system sustainability, let me be very clear. The sustainability of the private savings pillar was quite committed because of two obvious reasons. First of all, we know from years that 10% of mandatory contribution was not enough. And when it's not enough, you will have, with probability one, a problem of legitimacy when paying pensions and asking for the state to replace the private contributions. The second is that we withdraw 25% of the total saving. So everything constant, this means 25% of lower pensions. So increasing the problem of legitimacy and sustainability of the private saving scheme, which is the critical aspect of our capital market, of our growth, and of our economy. So this was in danger. I want to be very clear. The counterfactor of doing nothing or delaying the pension reform was at the cost of putting in danger our pillar of the private saving. Second, fiscal sustainability was at risk. Pepo mentioned, I do agree with him, we're facing strong and important fiscal challenges. But once again, the counterfactor of doing nothing was a bomb. And let me provide you with two examples. First of all, when you look, what does it mean, one extra point of mandatory contribution? This is $1 billion per year, okay? In 10 years, taking a return of like 3% per year in real terms, we are talking about 3.5 points of Chile's GDP, one single point of mandatory contribution. Multiply it by 6, and you arrive rapidly to 21 points of GDP. This is the potential cost for the state. Through what? Through, for instance, increasing PGU. And this is my second example. In this reform, PGU was increased in real terms only by 25,000 pesos, $25 per month. If you repeat the same, financing this small amount, issuing debt is 11 points of debt in terms of the Chile's GDP. So the fiscal cost of doing nothing or delaying was huge. So this is one. It's positive as well because aside from the view we can have on the details, and I do not agree with this and I agree with that, there are two obvious truths that are undeniable. First, this reform not only preserve but expand the private pension scheme. We will increase from 10% of mandatory contribution to 16% in the long run, and meanwhile, through 14.5%. So aside from our opinion, the numbers are the numbers. We have not only maintained, but increased this pillar of any sustainable pension system, which is the mandatory contribution. Second truth, this pension reform increased the room for private administrators. The former promise or the former bill was to replace the private administrations and putting some state administrator. This increased competition, and we can agree or disagree with the mechanism through the auctions. Okay, but the fact is that we will have more private administration and not less. And I think the two are positive. And let me finish by a third point, which I think is critical. This provides a good signal on the capacity that nevertheless the Chilean political system still have to reach some important agreement. It's true, we took like 3 governments to reach that point. But it's better than being unable to reach that agreement. And I think this points out in the direction that this country is able to convey on other important reforms, including permits that you discussed this morning, capital market reforms, state reform, and investment reforms. Okay, so from the political perspective, I see this is good as well. And on the capital market, just to answer your question, this, in rough numbers, will increase the mandatory contributions to the savings. Suppose that everything is going to the local capital market. From now to 10 years, this means 1.2 points of GDP of more extra saving to the capital market. The allocation between the local markets and abroad, we don't know, but in any case, we are increasing saving, we are increasing the capital market, and for me, at least, this is very good news.
Thank you, Ignacio. Jose, being today in New York, it's impossible to bring into the table the concepts of, not to bring into the table the concept of tariffs and global disruption. In a world shaped by geopolitical shift and considering Chile's reliance on the US and China, what strategic opportunities should the country follow to diversify its export base and reduce external vulnerability?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that our vulnerabilities are quite small. And I want to be, I think that we saw the global financial crisis, which is 10 times what's going on now. You know, we saw COVID and our financial system work and the economy suffer, but we were quite resilient. And I think that the issue was to think what's make us resilient, and especially in a world with all this geopolitical, I think that two things. First, what we have, an independent central bank, a strong financial system, floating exchange rate, make us quite strong. Now, I think that there is a much more political issue today, which is how we move in a world that's getting polarized. You know, there is we used to live after I would say the wall, the German wall destruction at the end of communism. We live a period with the hegemony of the US, countries growing, and there were no major geopolitical problems. Now we have geopolitical tensions big, and so becomes the issue, what's a country do? And I think that to have a very eclectic and not try to, we belong to the Western Hemisphere, so don't think that we are special. But that does not mean that we have to trade with all the world. In Asia, it's quite important for us, so we have to keep very good relations, but take I would say, a state of impartial view on all this great disorder and dislocation. Having said that, I think that this will also, although we are at the peak, or we were at the peak some weeks ago, this will also fade over time, because at the end, what's dominate is global markets, global firms. It's a trade system that needs to keep working. We saw what's happened with the tariff, that they were raised, they had to be reduced next day because it was a chaos. So I think that at the end, the economy and the system and globalization is much stronger, although the world will be hurt, and there are a lot of political dimensions and tensions that we will have ahead, and I think that it won't be easy to recover, but the damage is bounded.
Okay. Enrique, the world is facing demographic challenges, and Chile is not an exception. With a shrinking younger population and a growing number of older workers, how can Chile's private sector rethink on talent development and leadership to include women, youth, and the elderly as the drivers for economic growth?
Why get all the tough questions? You know, I may sound a little bit politically correct, but the diversity and inclusion has been in the agenda for quite a while already. Now, the discussions here is, first of all, what makes sense, and second, how you really make real progress. And I think companies are addressing this challenge, and when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're talking about all it's not just only gender, it's also about all people and all sort of different groups. And so the first question, as I said, is why? Why this makes sense to the business? Because if it doesn't make sense, it could be a very short-lived agenda or initiative. So you need to understand well why. And I think the companies in general, and I have more experience outside Chile than in Chile. I came back to Chile just the last 2 years, but I'm not directly involved in managing the company, just support member. But my experience coming from the US and how this agenda was developed, I think a big focus has to be in the company understand and why it's so important. And I'm a believer that a lot of that agenda is good news for the business. And the problem is then how you really start moving the needle, because it's hard to move the needle. I can tell you, for example, gender diversity or women in leadership position has been in the agenda for quite a while, at least in the US. And Walmart was quite active in trying to move the needle, and it was not easy. And I have personal experience where there was a lot of reason why not to hire a woman in a leadership positions, but if we were not, I would say, more deliberate in that we need to take those, because sometimes I thought it was a risk putting, and you see, we don't take those risks, we are not going to move the needle. At the end, my personal experience at the end was a good experience in terms of when we took the risk. It was not that probably we have a lot of unconscious bias or another situation that happened usually, at least with women in leadership position, is that probably their CV didn't look as good as the other candidates for obvious reason, also because they had less opportunities before. But we have to take I would say more deliberate actions in order to start moving the needle. And the same with age groups and etc. That's the good news. The bad news, I will say, is that effective leadership doesn't have gender. So women fails as much as men. So why I said that is because I think anybody, doesn't matter what gender or whatever, you need to prepare yourself to lead. And at the end, effective leadership has, in my view and in my experience, has nothing to do with your gender or with any other aspect. And so that's a challenge, and that you need to, in order to do well, you need to prepare yourself.
Thank you. Ignacio, let me shift to the political environment so Enrique will not blame me. How do you assess the feasibility of building a long-term fiscal pact in today's fragmented political environment?
Wow, it's a great question because it involves rather more than a fiscal pact. I think it involves everything because we are in a situation in which I do believe we require a long-term and strategic vision. We have all the elements to be successful there, but we need collaboration between the political sector in order to take decisions, because let me say this very clear. Many people still believe that willingness is enough to move forward. And this is absurd. This is completely absurd. We know that willingness is not enough. And we have too many examples. Willingness should be transformed into actions, and actions require political commitment because you move based on incentives. We need incentives for investment, for entrepreneurship, for productivity, for innovation. And incentives are rules, and the rules are set in the political discussion, typically through reforms. So this is why Jose and others hired by the Minister of Finance in the Marfan Commission, in a series of proposals for fostering growth. The first one we proposed, and apparently there is an agreement, but no movement in the political arena, is the reform to the rules of the political system. Because with this level of fragmentation, as you mentioned, and indiscipline, it's quite difficult to reach agreements. And without agreements, we cannot expect reforms changing the incentives, and we cannot expect to have different results. This is the reality, this is the truth. And it's a pity that we had failed in advance at this regard. We failed in the second constitutional process. There is a bill in Congress, but there is no chance to be approved. I would like to say that neither the government nor a significant part of the opposition nor the business sector has really pushed forward, because probably we don't understand that this is the cornerstone for having good reforms and agreements that we need. And I come back to the fiscal agreement. This is part of what we need. We know that we have stressed finances, but it's important to recognize that this is a structural problem. You tend to put the responsibility in who is in government at the given moment. This is a problem lasting for more than a decade and worsening. Okay, so we need to stop it. But to stop it requires agreements, because it's not easy to cut spending. We hear many, many times, like marketing phrases saying, no, we will cut 3 or 4 points of GDP. This is bullshit. Let me be very clear. This is not feasible. This is willingness, only willingness. We need an agreement, because let me say something, just to put it in Spanish, and I will stop here. If we end with a structural deficit of 2% of GDP, okay, going through equilibrium in 4 years, which seems very reasonable, and somebody could say you should be even more ambitious in 2 years. Well, in 4 years, this means in Spanish that the budget should not grow in real terms in every single of the forthcoming 4 years. I never have seen this in the reality. Okay, so this requires a commitment in order to address that. We recognize that we have a problem, and the problem should be fixed, because the reality is that obviously we have been spending or committing permanent spendings that are misaligned with our permanent revenues. That's the reality. That's the reality. Okay, but cutting permanent spending is difficult. Okay, and we don't have more room for improving permanent revenues. Okay, so we need efficiency. We need to cut spending, but we need to go digger into some specific programs. And politically, this is difficult. This is why we need that kind of agreement. Okay, and I'm confident that we will be able to do this. But this is a shared challenge. It's not just a single administration. This is a structural problem. And the same is valid towards having a long-term strategy, looking into the future, looking into the long term. I have here this morning, Bernardo is here, the possibilities that we have in all the energy sector, tourism, critical mining, critical minerals, and so on and so forth. We have the material, but we need the incentives. And we need the ambition to say, look, we are producing 100. Why if we move to 150 in 2050? This is an ambitious goal. But then you have to set the ambitious instruments. We had to do with permits, we had to do with taxes, we had to do with a series of things that should be agreed, because only talking about growth is not enough. This is only willingness, and willingness is wishful thinking, yes.
Thank you, Ignacio. Jose, one of the purposes of Chile Day is promote Chile and promote our capital markets. How can Chile strengthen its capital markets to become a more effective driver of investments in transformation and economic growth?
I'll make 2 comments before going to that. I would forget anyway your question. First, I fully agree. I think that if we have big problem of growth in Chile, it's the political system. Why? Because we need agreements that sometimes are very tough. And when you have a lot of small and medium political parties, they just look at the way to survive, and it's impossible to make and to have and to agree on strong things. And I'll mention a couple of them. So I think that is essential to have a system, and let me put it this way, we can discuss a lot, but that the end result similar to the binomial system that we had before, but without the binomial. So there are many ways, and we lose two opportunities with two constitutional conventions, and I think that that's key, because it's right, Ignacio said we approved the pension reform after 10 years. 10 years to have a pension reform, we're all knew that we have to increase contributions. So it's quite long. It looks like the permisología, but it's so I think that's quite important. The second thing, we have a little, I know that there may be a question later, but we have little space to increase revenues. We may have some things with copper, but we have seen the political discussion around taxation, and we'll say, well, okay, we'll reduce taxes, but we need compensation, and always it's kind of messy. And I would leave the tax system, I wouldn't move it that much, because I think that there is little space. But having little space, we have the risk that increasing social expenditure may lead to increasing fiscal weakness. So what they would do, and I think that we should have done it with the PGU, and we should do in all social expenditure, make them contingent on the fiscal position. In the US, I think that there is a law in which if you don't get enough funding, then the benefits expire. So something like that. I think I would say, for example, if we don't have some fiscal results, we don't increase by inflation. There is no by inflation social benefit. I think that are hard. The governments will put a lot of effort to do. The second thing, before going to your question, we need what's a big one of the big problems, and also one of the big problems we have to reduce government expenditure. We always say we will eliminate all the inefficient programs, and all candidates say the same, but they never can. One of the reasons why they cannot is because when you create a program, you create a bureaucracy, and you cannot get rid of bureaucracy because they become permanent workers according to our system of public employment. I think we have to change public employment and leave the inamobility for special small sector, and the rest the same as in the private sector. So you can fire them with the severance payments, but not what's happened today. So we have all this problem with permisología, with everything. We have a lot of institutions, and people have to work, and what they work is to, writing permits and not, and that's what they do, and so I think that's very complicated. Then your question was about the
capital markets,
the financial system. Let me say, I'm kind of positive in general in my life. I try to be positive, and so the first thing, being in New York, and people say, well, what's good about Chile? I say, look, to be very honest, I'm not. Chile is a great country. We had the most leftist government, together with Allende government, and they approved a pension reform that is more AFPs, not less AFPs. Second, they approved the TPP-11, the CTPP. So it's we can complain about many political things, but the core of Chile is quite strong. No, we have problems, and I think that the problem of the permits, and this is, and I'm a bit more radical, I think that we have a big problem there. But as a country, as a basis, as a stability, it's amazing. It's amazing. The most leftist government that was to change a model, it was to do all the productive matrix and all of that things. We're finishing, and we came back to, it's a social democrat government. People say, well, because they look, whatever. But I don't want to explain it. I say that the fact is that this is quite a strong country. is a strong country. There is I think that is quite forthcoming for foreign investment, and so I think that that's pretty good. Now the problem is that we don't have too many projects, and when you go to invest, you have to spend 10 years, looking for permits, and there are some problems. And let me just say one more thing.
Yes.
Because the only thing I don't like, because I think that many people have said it, and I don't like this idea of coming back to the DL600. That's old-fashioned. That's the world is very different. When I was military, I tried to get rid of DL600. It was tough because I was a recession. DL600 was mainly a vehicle to bring money. It was not to ensure, because it was to make sure that people that invest in Chile, they can get the returns, they won't be expropriated, and many things that today don't happen. So the issue is, what about the DL600 to provide invariability in the tax system? Well, we can do invariability for all new investment. We can think about, I don't know what Minister Krau was saying about you enter and you pay with the rules that you start. Some say that's quite difficult. First, because it's quite, to distinguish between foreigners and locals today is quite difficult. Many of you here perhaps are Chileans incorporated abroad, in New York or wherever. So you'll have a benefits, and I'm not, because I'm in Chile, so I'll have to move here if I want. It doesn't make that much sense. And also it's very difficult to say what is for new investment, for which kind of investment. If a mining company is investment to increase production, that goes, or is for a new mine. And what do you do if you finance with retained earnings, or you have to bring the money? That's old-fashioned. It's completely old-fashioned. We have to think about the country with more predictability, in which you don't go through a process of permits and you don't have to spend 10 years, or you spend 3 years and then they say that's not feasible. Those are the things that we have to think, I think. And we have a lot to do that, and I think it's very good what the government, what the discussion of people from outside the government is doing, because it's what's very good, and this is the last thing that I will say. The good thing is that there is a huge agreement in the country that all this permisología, I don't like permisología, call it, I like the capture of the state, but group of interests, but all these issues have to change. And I always say people, they have to change before we have a reaction like Dutch here. You say we'll get rid of everything, and then we go with the seesaw. Yeah, that's with the change. So so I think that we have to do it before the problem is too
big,
too bad. Okay.
Thank you.
I hope I answered to your question.
Enrique, you're a leader on the corporate sector. How can the corporate sector rebuild public trust and demonstrate a genuine commitment to social progress in ways that also contribute to Chile's economic growth and stability?
Yeah, I think trust is an issue in Chile in general. So we do have an issue with trust, and of course the private sector is not an exception, and we do have a challenge. And it's interesting when you discuss this. Usually, this conversation is quite internal, and so it's the typical conversation internally and how we are in terms of trust, and we tend to look at our constituencies, which is most of the people who work with us, and companies do a lot of climate surveys, and they always worry about what their own people feel about the company and our purpose, and et cetera, et cetera. And this is most of the company, or at least big companies, they do that. And I guess, and in my experience, what you see there is that in general, the perception and the trust on the company is very high. There's not a big issue in terms of how much the people trust or they believe in the company, but when you go to the public opinion and you get what we know, it's quite low, it's relatively low for companies, and it has been the case for quite a while. And you say, well, why the perception is so different? So when it's like somebody was telling me, it's like you trust in your own bank, but you don't trust on banks. When it's generic, you don't trust. So you trust in your own. So this is kind of similar situation. Where you know better, but the rest. And there, I think the answer is just communication. There's no other answer. It's how we improve, how we do a better communication externally, not only internally, because in general, the internal job is done well. And it was my case in my previous company, it's the case with Falabella, it's exactly the same case. But externally, I think the job we do is not good. It's just, the surveys, the polls, they show that we don't do a very good job. And what happens is when you are not very effective in communicating, somebody else take over the conversation. And we know that there are people, there are institutions that they have within the agenda probably not to speak very highly about business. So we need to take that challenge. Now, how we do that? I think every company has to take their own responsibility in terms of how you improve, and this is it's not only about what we do well, because that's not enough. We need to communicate, tireless, in terms of what we do, why we think we add value to society, not only to the people who work with us, not only to our customers, but in general. Why we do good, and there is a lot of good in the companies and what we do. So, communication. That's
the key. Thank you, Ignacio. If you had to prioritize one key change, whether institutional, economic, or social, to unlock Chile's full development potential in the next decade, what would it be and why?
I don't like to answer in the clue of silver bullets, because I do not believe in silver bullets. So let me cheat a little bit on your question and saying more than one thing. I think the first one is pretty obvious, is to stop of just saying we have to grow, which is so typical and so mediocre, because it expects that somebody makes the job and the proposals. We have to be involved, all of us, in this, and this is a tough, process. It's not easy. There is no silver bullet. Growth depends on real variables, fostering productivity and investment, and within them there are a series of instruments we have to address and reform that have to be addressed that are all of them difficult from the political perspective. So we need to stop to simply talk about growth, and we need to go through action. Otherwise, we will continue to meet here and saying, well, Chile has to resume growth, but we will not see different results. So at this regards, in the reforms, I think we have to dig into what a group of colleagues and myself call the uncomfortable truth, the kind of thing we know we need to do, but in practice we avoid because we touch with group of interests, both from the private and the public sector. And so we speak a lot, but we never deliver, okay? Let me say some issues here. First, and Pepo mentioned this, it's the reform of the public work is the first of them. Okay, and we know we have to change the Estatuto Administrativo, coming from '89, so the last law from the dictatorship, which impedes to manage the state. Everyone wants to manage better the state, but as you all know, if you are unable to manage human resources and teams, you are unable to manage the whole. That's the reality. We know everyone is impressed by this case of the 25,000 illicit medical licenses in the state. But we know for years a series of other frauds within the state, and we do nothing, and we do not care. Let me mention just one. Evaluation process. This is a lie. This is a fraud. How do you call a process in which almost 100% of your employees is receiving the maximum qualification? It's not a fraud. This is a fraud with public resources, and we are unable to do anything. Okay, so we have to commit here to move forward, changing the Estatuto Administrativo, having more flexibility, having more merit within the public servant career, and have true evaluation, meaning that the people that is not delivering should be fired, as in the private sector. And the ones that are doing their job with excellence should be recognized, okay, symmetrically. This is one. Second, education, education, education. It's amazing. We know for years that our kids are not reaching the minimum levels in writing, reading, and the basic arithmetic operations. And we do not care. And so what's the future of Chile without solving those problems? Instead, we continue to talk about university and the financing and so on. This is a scandal, you know? We know what's the priority, but we are not able to commit ourselves in moving in that direction. I already mentioned the political system. This is part of the clue for everything. But let me finish with a positive word, because I agree with Pepo. I really believe that we have a tremendous country with institutional strength. The proof is that even with the riots, even with the two constitutional process and their uncertainties and the polarization, we have been able to get out through the rules, through our institutions. This is quite unique. We have validated the constitution that was so criticized in the past. And the economy, aside of all of this, yes, it's growing at a mediocre 2%. But this is a mediocrity we are carrying for a decade, at least. Okay? So you can see this from the bad side or the good side. The bad side, 2% is mediocre. The good side is that aside from all the changes, our institutional strengths allow us to have this 2% level. And so the question is how to reach or how to get the upside. And there are huge chances for having the upside. And this has to do with some important agreements I see in Chile. I do agree with Pepo, which are necessary conditions, not sufficient conditions, but are necessary conditions. First of all, there is an agreement, renew agreement on growth and its importance. You will say, well, this is obvious. No, it's not obvious. 5 years ago, it was not the case. Some people believe that this was for granted, and you can do whatever you want, and growth will continue. Some others believe in degrowth. Okay? Today, we have this consensus. This is positive. Second consensus on security and delinquency and the cost, social cost and economic cost. Good news. Necessary condition, not sufficient, but necessary. Third consensus. Our natural resource is part of our future growth, and we have to recognize and to be proud of this, against the anti-extractivism speech that was so present a couple of years ago. And the good news is this government buried this speech. You know why? Because they launched a lithium strategy that you can agree or disagree, but which has a clear goal to expand lithium production. I ask you, is there any other more extractive sector than lithium? I don't think so, isn't it? So basically the government said, we want to be more extractivism, not less. And this is good news, because you can expand this for copper, for rare minerals, for salmon, for forests, for agro-industry, for everything. And this is good. This is good news. Finally, there is also a consensus on the importance on fiscal sustainability. This is amazing, and it talks very well of us as a country. In which country, in middle of the vacation in the summer, the fiscal balance that was launched in February was a matter of discussion widespread in every house? I don't know any other country in which the conversation was set in fiscal issues. This is very important. It means that the Chileans care about the situation and understand the basic of fiscality, because it's the same logic done in their households, in their houses, with their budget. They have to manage their budget. And they know that if you are spending more than your revenues, you are increasing your debt, and this can end bad, you know? So a series of agreements which are necessary condition, but not sufficient condition, that makes me to be optimistic in what we can do, and hopefully we will pursue this venue of agreement to leverage our growth based on that.
Thank you. And Enrique, Jose, do you want to add one priority or key change?
I will follow just what Ignacio said. Things that we shouldn't say, and the list is we have a lot of agreement, and we have to build on those agreements. And of course, not to talk about generalities, that we need the new growth strategy. What's a new growth strategy? Which is very easy to say it and to get some applause. But there are a lot of, I think that in the state, in education, we have a lot of agreements, and we have to build on that. I think that what we need is the political strength to push them. And I'm not very optimistic. I won't say it will happen, but I think I will have to try. And there is some opportunity in the coming elections in which the discussion should be around these issues, about the issues of the state, with the scandal that we have with the medical licenses is quite important, on what to do for the future on security, which I think that's number one for people. And I think that we have a great opportunity to reach some agreement. I think that all these ideas of polarization that the country kind of have been, still there are extremes, and I think but we're kind of converging on what are the real issues of Chile. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
I just will add to this consensus mood that Ignacio was referring. Probably the discussion about what should be our reasonable framework for people and companies to develop their activities, because we do speak a lot about permits, and we have spoke a lot about regulations, but it's not only about, because permit is kind of the symptom of I would say a bigger illness, because it's not only about permits, it's also about labor regulation, it's about criminal liability laws for companies. It's about many new regulations that are being discussed, and without perhaps or with a lot of good intentions, and sometimes in order looking at some benchmark or reference, we look a lot to Europe. We don't look much to the US, which you see they have a different approach to this. We jump very quickly sometimes in this regulation without understanding what are the unintended consequences. And all this has unintended consequences. And if you add all of this, there are even bigger unintended consequences. And we need to be sure that the benefit of what we're seeking are higher or bigger than the cost of the unintended consequence, so that the cost of those unintended consequences. And sometimes, and because you can see the impact, sometimes it's easy to see the cost in being part of in the business world. It's easy to see the costs and the impacts. Not necessarily it's easy to see the benefits. So that is, I think, it has to be part of the discussion, because it's. And the last thing I will say, then, and Jose was referring before on another unintended consequence of all we're talking about is that for the incumbent, because people will say, oh, the company are doing well, yeah, I cannot complain, to be honest. But I'm a big company. I'm an incumbent. And we tend to benefit when things get tricky and when, it's difficult to compete. Tempo here is trying to develop and to be a disruptor and to compete with big guys. They have been there for a long time. It's hard. I'm sure it's very hard. And because of the regulations, and so we have these unintended consequences that the competitive environment get impacted. And this is not good. At the end, in long term, it's not a very good news for the customers and for the people. So that's why it's so relevant, this discussion and this consensus about what is the reasonable framework that we need to have.
May I add something very, very short?
Sure.
About this consensus and permit, that was one of the main subjects of discussion. It's important to realize the principle which is embedded in the bill of sectoral permits that Minister Grau presented this morning, because you can criticize the project because it's partial, because it should have been more ambitious and so on, but there is a principle that allows to build on this consensus, which is another sufficient condition, necessary condition, but not sufficient condition, we have in Chile. Everybody agrees that this is a high indirect tax on investment, and that it should not be the case. And the principle embedded in the project, and I invite you to read it, is as follows in a sense. In a sense, it states that permits are necessary, set the standard as high as you want, but then have a regulatory framework that is related with the accomplishment of that standard, and get rid out of all the other regulations that do not compel with that standard. And for me, this is a very, very important principle to be expanded in the forthcoming discussion, which is the environmental regulation. This is the next step, but based on the same principle and framework. So you can build on that. And I think this is an important consensus we have, not only in terms of the cost of permits, but in terms of the way of addressing the problem.
Thank you very much for this rich conversation. What we have heard today is clear. Unlocking Chile's economic potential is not just about GDP or markets. Chile's economic future will not be shaped by any single sector, policy, or leader. It will require coordination, long-term thinking, and the courage to evolve. Chile has the talent, the ideas, and the capacity to grow. What we need now is vision and determination. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Los profesores de corbata y
Es que es muy cool, Enrique.
Thanks to our panelists for a great discussion. As we conclude this panel, we reflect on successful day of exploring Chile's economic landscape, from Minister Grau, insightful presentation, to our depth discussions on permitting requirements, investment trends, AI, and neobanks, Chilean pensions, capital market regulations, Mrs. Rosana Costa complete presentation, and ending insights on how to unlock our country's potential and accelerate economic growth. It seems we have covered a lot of topics. Today we provided a valuable platform for discussing Chile's investment opportunities and challenges, and I am confident that the insights shared today will contribute to fostering great understanding and collaboration between Chile and the international business community. For our final activity today, we invite you to join us outside in the gallery for a reception. This is a great opportunity to discuss the topics we have covered and enjoying a relaxed